I've known him for quite some time in our background in the Coast Guard, at prior Army as well. He gives a lot back to the industry, in particular as the industry co-chair of the U.S. Helicopter Safety Team. He's quite the Renaissance man. He's flown ever since he got out of diapers, I think, over 20,000 hours, and he's going to get embarrassed if I keep going on, so I'll hand it back over to him.
Thanks, Chris. Well, Chris Hill is an accomplished helicopter pilot, both having flown Apaches in the Army and Dolphins and other things in the Coast Guard. Chris is from that age of you have to go out, but you don't have to come back, performing many rescues, and knows what it's like to be wakened at 2 o'clock in the morning in February to go rescue a boat that's sinking off out in the Atlantic Ocean off the coast of New York or New Jersey. He serves with the VAI, if you're not familiar, the Vertical Aviation International, which is the premier organization for all things in vertical flight. And Chris heads up safety for VAI, and he's also the chairman of the VAST, or the Vertical Aviation Safety Team, and serves on the steering committee for the U.S. Helicopter Safety Team. An amazing, accomplished presenter, aviator, and safety professional.
Wow. Okay, we've gotten that taken care of. Appreciate that, Chris. So I'll go ahead and continue on and give this back to Chris. He's going to give us a little primer for what we're going to talk about today.
So pre-flight, what does pre-flight mean to you? And does it matter if you're flying the helicopter like you would see in this depiction, or you're flying a DC-9, or you're flying a Cherokee 6? Phil Dixon in that primer video talked about after maintenance. And I would say a little play on words here, where we tried to create what you might find in Greek, Latin, but it's all the same. It's a little bit more than making sure the big pieces are still there, making sure that, well, all I care about is if the radios work, or, I kick the tires, let's light the fire and jump in. For those who have done that and gotten away with it, good for you. Sooner or later, it'll catch up to you, where you'll miss something that was pretty obvious on pre-flight. And if it doesn't work on the ground, I guarantee you it's not going to work any better in the air. So when you show up at your aircraft, make sure you budget enough time to give it a good going through. And if it's been in maintenance, wow, you really want to spend a little bit of extra time with it.
All right. Thanks, Chris. So before we go on to the next, I just want to reiterate one thing that's important. We acknowledge that a good chunk of you here today are probably not predominantly helicopter pilots. We know that. We appreciate it. The classic moniker of know your audience. We acknowledge that. But we'd like to think that much of what we talk about today is easily correlated to what you do every day, no matter what type of aircraft you fly. So keeping that in mind, we'll go ahead and start first with just talking about how the U.S. Helicopter Safety Team got involved in providing resources and what types of resources that they've put together. So on your screen, you see a little QR code. You'll see a few of those as we go through the presentation. Feel free to scan that with your phone and tuck that away for future reference. We'll briefly skim some of the items here today, but we won't go do a deep dive. We'll just highlight a few things that are within those resources. So as you can see from the title here, the team, along with several other issues that they discovered several years ago, they reviewed over 100 different fatal accidents in helicopters in the U.S. and they went back and did a retrospective analysis and tried to unpack all of the reasons why these fatal accidents occurred. And the analysis team got together and they came up with what at the time ended up being 16 legacy and 5 new helicopter safety enhancements, all of them trying to prevent repeat events that were killing our pilots in helicopters. So one of them, obviously things that were discovered after the accident that could have been prevented with a proper final walk around, or security of external cargo. So you might have heard of some of these types of things in the past in the news, but not to sensationalize it, we're just going to kind of run through a couple of the items that the team came up with. They put together a recommended practice document, And then they had a couple of other artifacts to accompany that. And then they have an outreach program where we kind of get on the road and we do things like what we're doing today to kind of reemphasize the information that was collected and the lessons that were learned. So drilling down again, the recommended practice was kind of like the primary document for this helicopter safety enhancement. And it's available online that if you scan that QR code you saw previously, that'll take you to all of the helicopter safety enhancements, and this one in particular, you can drill down and take a look at that. In addition to that, there were a couple of other, press release type items that were, tried to distill it down into simple, this one here is 12 rules to live by. And then finally, let's see, I went backward. Finally, the last item here will go to everybody loves pictures and videos. So this one kind of just, in a relationship with HAI at the time, now VAI, they've had an ongoing relationship with USAIG Insurance, and they still do these posters a lot. And the most recent poster in collaboration we did with them was focused on this particular task. So it's a bit of an eye chart on this. So I'll just talk about a couple items that we're focused on in this particular video, and that will kind of shape what we talk about throughout the rest of this webinar and questions that you might have. So it's one of the obvious ones that people continue to miss is make sure everything's secure, including the fuel cap. Nothing more embarrassing, even if you were able to get out of it without trouble, it can cause subsequent damage. Another one that clearly is often missed, maybe it's just a poor latch mechanism that looked good, double checking all those as you continue on. Another, not only on the ground, but on, decks, engine decks, transmission decks, things of that nature, looking for any obvious signs of leaks. Here's one, Chris. I don't know have you ever seen somebody light off a helicopter with an engine plug still in the back exhaust? It did its job to prevent the rain from coming in, but then all of a sudden that smoky sound and that smoky smell, and then the smoke that comes out, it's a pretty embarrassing moment. So make sure you take care of all of those, what we called flyaway gear at the time, the pitot tube covers, all the plugs that are there. Yeah. Let's see. And the tie downs, still to this day, I still remember people, firmly secured to the deck and trying to take off and wondering why so much power was required to take off. So that's another good one there. And then of course, no loose gear, particularly in the modern, impromptu landing areas, particularly for helicopters, whether it be on the side of a highway, a helicopter roof pad. There's always something that is trying to get in your way, loose, get sucked up into an exhaust or a propeller of some sort or a rotor. So those are just a few of the areas that we're focused on this particular poster here, just to kind of do an appetizer of what's more to come. So we're going to pivot into some practices. Before I go too deep into that, just an acknowledgement, you'll probably hear it more than once, is always look at your OEM guidance, rotorcraft flight manual, whatever it is, or company policy, whatever is out there, as your primary document to dictate how you behave before, during, and after flights. However, we think that some of these practices that we'll talk about today, you can use as a supplement to ensure that it's tailored to your specific needs and things that you understand and care about, on top of what is already required for you to operate. So let's just ask, Chris, you and I have talked through this, and maybe some of you listening can come up with what are some of the most interesting things you found on a pre-flight or post-flight. And this poster here, and again, another USAIG poster, it's a mechanic finding a bird's nest in an engine intake on a helicopter there. And so that's obviously one of the more popular items that people find out there. I've certainly found my share of nests and that sort of thing. Anything pop into your head, Chris, that is more interesting from you?
Yeah, it's a lifetime of finding things that I didn't expect to find, or someone said to me, hey, I pulled your aircraft out. I don't know if you noticed, but there's masking tape all over the bottom of the fuselage. And what that was is it had come back from avionics, and they had put masking tape over the static ports. And this line guy, not a mechanic, said, hey, Chris, I saw this. And wow, that was certainly helpful. I hope I would have found it on pre-flight, but you just never know. what you'll find with an aircraft, even if you're familiar with it, if other people have had any interaction.
Yeah, that's a good point. You point out, those static ports being clogged. Something that, at VAI, we have an annual trade show called Verticon, and we have some pretty strict guidance we offer to our exhibitors. And it's before coming into the exhibit center, making sure the aircraft is safe to be positioned, and then before departing. And this applies to anybody who goes to fly-ins, air shows, that sort of thing. You just have to assume that somebody has tried to sabotage your aircraft, either unwittingly or, maliciously, whatever it is. Treat every one of those types of pre-flights as a major maintenance post pre-flight, if you will. And the chances are you'll find something very interesting in one of those. So just we're not here to preach to anybody here. This is all
No.
based on personal experiences and things that our friends and colleagues have experienced over time. So just a couple other items that are commonly, improper installation and parts that are loose, things of that nature. I think of one thing that's important is the post-flight piece, and we can talk about that as we go along. But as you finish a flight, it's important to take a look at the end to make sure, hey, I don't want to leave this aircraft in bad condition or something that's questionable for the next person to fly and cause further delays, that sort of thing. So, Laura, it looks like you might have something to add to the conversation.
I do. One attendee said he had a tail cone that had a rub with the stabilator after the annual was completed, required loosening the screws and repositioning the tail cone to free it up.
All right. Yeah, some good stuff there. And, that's a perfect example. So, if you encounter something, one of the things that's pretty common are loose things that are maybe within tolerances or cracks that are within limits. So finding those and acknowledging what the limits are, getting a proper qualified maintenance personnel to verify, okay, you're still within limits, but the next person, they might say, well, I don't know what the limits are. So having a good documentation in the maintenance record, what the allowable tolerances are, and then everybody can monitor that very closely in subsequent flights. So yeah, fluid leaks, FOD, all of the above. I think we've experienced all of them. So without any further commentary there, I'm going to go ahead and pass it off to Chris, who will take us on to the next one, talking about pre-flight walk around and control checks.
This is a very interesting situation and one that you'd kind of scratch your head where you've had not one but two of these incidents involving this particular helicopter where a single switch was missed. So in this case study, there is a hydraulic servo for the tail rotor, and there is a switch in the cockpit that essentially turns it on and off. And it's on a checklist. But the pilot, in this case, two pilots on two separate occasions, missed turning the switch on. So they took off without that servo being powered hydraulically, which caused the aircraft to crash. And a lot of us, talk about checklist discipline. There's all different kinds of checklists. There's challenge and response, there's flows, and then you'll go back and you'll do and confirm. It doesn't matter what type of checklist you use. What matters is that you not only use it, but you understand it and that you don't rush it. And if you're interrupted, what do? Do you go back to the beginning of the checklist? I think that's a great technique. But oftentimes people miss things, not intentionally, but simply because they're running the checklist and there's an interruption to it. And then they pick up the checklist again and maybe skipped over one or two items that could turn out to be fatal. So in this case, there's a safety bulletin that came out that said, look, this switch is important. And if not engaged, it's going to cause the tail rotor servo to be unpowered and you could lose control of the helicopter.
Yeah, good example there. And these types of accidents just kind of baffle our OEMs and kind of drive them a little crazy because the public, they often don't get the information until a couple of years later on what really happened. And so, it's important to make sure that you always follow these safety information notices. They're there for a reason, and they don't want to keep having those repeat events. All right, let's move on to the next one.
So
All
don't
right.
become don't become a safety bulletin that comes out because you rushed and missed something, and people are going to say, "Oh, look, I would have." It's great to armchair quarterback. I wouldn't have done that, but the way I see it, if somebody did it, I could do it on any given day. Depending on how you feel, are you rushing yourself? Are you not spending the time on it that you should, and you overlook something? And this next one is an example of that involving maintenance.
Yeah, so this is the R-44 news helicopter crash due to loose missing hardware and service letters not followed. Just another example. We've touched on this post-maintenance one already quite a bit, and Robinson certainly took this one seriously and provided a safety notice. So just as Chris was talking about, anything to add?
Yes, because sometimes you'll be in a situation, and I find myself in one. I was in an MD 500 helicopter that had come out of maintenance, and I had the mechanic on board. And this was, if anybody's from Islip knows where that airport is, I was in about in the middle of the field, towards the end of the day, and I was doing an out of ground effect hover check, and the engine quit. Um, Probably the worst time for that to happen. And what had occurred is the mechanics had left a tool, a part, inside of the plenum, not a place that I could have inspected, and it was ingested into the engine and it caused it to quit. Fortunately, there was no damage to the aircraft, the helicopter. I was able to get it on the ground, in one piece, and we got it repaired after that. But my message is sometimes after maintenance, you may fall victim to something that you can't see on a pre-flight, no matter how hard you look. Just be prepared during this flight, for something to go wrong, so you're in a good position, where you're performing these checks, where you're not going to hit anything, or you're not going to have what we'll call collateral damage. So be prepared for an engine failure at any point, or any other type of failure in the early part of your flight.
Yeah, and that's a good point, and that's why in the helicopter world, for those of you who are in that world, the FAA had a SAFO, safety of flight, uh, notice that basically said anytime you pick up a helicopter, to fly, you're flying long before your wheels or your skids come free of the ground. You're performing a initial hover check before you go yanking the pitch and just go, hauling ass out of there, because that's the time when a lot of issues are discovered. So that initial hover check is pretty critical, and we emphasize that quite religiously on any activities that we're involved in at VAI. All right, so post-flight, between flight shutdown checks. Got another question there. If you spot a discrepancy during pre-flight or post-flight, what are we supposed to do? I talked a little bit about it initially a little while ago. This is intended to kind of pique people's interest in the audience. How do you handle when you find something, particularly maybe you're at a remote location, you don't have immediate answers, that sort of thing.
One thing I like to do, no matter what aircraft I'm pre-flighting, is I always have my phone handy. Not because I'm talking to somebody, but because if I need to take a picture and send it. And that picture could be used for a variety of purposes. If you've got a mechanic, and like Chris saying, you're in a place where it's kind of remote, you can take a picture of something that you have concerns about and send it and say, what is this? It looks like I'm seeing evidence of fluid here. Is that, could this potentially be a leak? Is this something that, you want to take a look at before I fly the aircraft again? Do I want to write this up, or is this normal? It also is good for training, especially for instructors, where you'll find something, an abnormality in your pre-flight or your post-flight, and you can share that with students.
Yeah, all good stuff there. Thanks, Chris. All right, and so just to, put a bug in your ear. Think about, how are you going to handle those discrepancies, and more importantly, getting them documented so the next person who flies that aircraft, has a clear understanding of what's the history, and the maintenance personnel can, pick up where you left off, depending on if things are getting worse, in a very, very insidious way. Laura asked a question. I'll go ahead and hit it right now. I showed a poster at the beginning, and we'll probably show a few more here in a couple slides. Where do we get those? We'll provide another QR code and provide the web URL so you can be aware of how to get those, easy to find. Okay, let's see here. What next? What do we have? All right. So
This is a great one.
yeah. So what to look for after landing. So this is looking at, pause a beat and see if the audience, I don't know how large the image is on your particular screen, especially if you're on a phone, you're probably not going to be able to see this, but this is a Coast Guard H-60 tailwheel assembly. And this item was found on post flight. So it's kind of revealing. If you go look it up, you can track that down in the news, but that is a snake. So I'm not sure where it was. I think it was a Florida-based aircraft at the time. So it's interesting the types of things you can find on post-flight, and it kind of makes you wonder, well, wow, did I not see that during pre-flight? I saw one of the comments that somebody made, Phil Dixon's pre-flight video, where he had his, humbling lesson learned, where he took, tried to take off without a battery connected. Everybody out there, no matter how excellent of a pilot or skilled maintainer, whatever, they're going to make human mistakes. Something tripped them up, might be during a pre-flight. And it's a good point to make, is that distraction piece. Right at the moment where you were supposed to be checking that battery compartment, somebody may have tapped him on the shoulder and asked him a question. And then when that conversation was finished, in his mind, he thought he finished that phase of the inspection and moved on. So I can't count how many times I've made that kind of a mistake in my past career flying active. And I'm sure many folks out there, if you're honest with yourself, that happens to you too. So one of the things we talk about in helicopter pre-flights in particular, and a lot of people don't like it, is if you get interrupted during your pre-flight, the model is to start all over again. So that a lot of people have a hard time stomaching that. And then another one is when you're finished, even if you aren't interrupted, you kind of go around a little bit more beyond where you began, because when you started, you may not have been fully engaged in that moment. Laura, you got something for us?
Yeah, I do. Just a comment to add. If you're out at the airport and you see that your hangar neighbor is pre-flighting or your friend is pre-flighting, that's not the time to go over and say, hey, where are you flying today? It's beautiful out. That's the time to just step away and let them have their time to pre-flight and don't interrupt them.
Yeah, that's great, Laura. Thanks for that. And that's something that, as a former safety guy in the Coast Guard and, in my subsequent career, I made it a point when I visited a unit or an air station, maintenance hangar, I would make sure that anytime I was going up to do interviews or talk to people, if anybody was even remotely near an aircraft, looked like they had a checklist in their hand, I wouldn't even engage them in conversation. Look the other way, let them keep doing what they do, because the whole point of you being there was to ensure that they're safe. The last thing in the world you want to do is be a contributor to a distraction that could lead to a problem that specifically you're there to try to prevent happening. Any experience with that, Chris?
Yes, unfortunately. At my own airport, there's one person that anytime they see me, they have to come up and talk to me. I'm almost guaranteed to stop what I'm doing to do that. And at the airlines, oftentimes people will come up into the cockpit and ask you questions and stuff while you're running checklists or you're performing briefings, and it's frustrating. And it's easy to get distracted and then miss something unintentionally. So have techniques that you can employ to kind of reset it, as Chris said, so you don't miss something and you don't get distracted or even get too frustrated with somebody. I don't think people are intentioned the wrong way. Sometimes they're just genuinely excited to see you. So they just don't know better. And that's a point maybe of education to say, hey, I'm really glad you came up. It's great to talk to you, but right now we're in the middle of doing this, and it's a little bit of a safety distraction. So
Yeah, it's an easy thing as a takeaway from this webinar itself is just say, hey, look, if you're a part of an organization that can communicate this type of message, like, hey, anytime you see somebody working on an aircraft, whether it be pre-flight or maintenance, leave them alone. You know, go to their supervisor who's in a shop somewhere and just say, hey, I'd like to talk to so and so when they're done. Can you arrange that for me? And that way you're not part of the problem. And you can start that today.
That's an excellent point too about maintenance. I cannot tell you that I have flown with pilots when an aircraft was broken or wasn't ready on time for a test flight, and the individual I'm with stood there and stared at the mechanic. And I was like, "Hey, man, let's go get a cup of coffee." No, this we gotta go. I'm like, "Yeah, okay," but staring at him isn't gonna make him work any faster, and it's annoying to him.
Yeah.
So give the guy or the girl the space that they need to do their job without you staring at them, and you know, just tell
Yeah.
them, hey, when you need me, I'll be over here.
Yeah, all the engineers, maintenance folks on this webinar are cheering you right now, saying, "Yes, please leave us alone. Let us do our job." Even to the point where sometimes you might get a supervisor say, "Hey, look, I'm not trying to pressure you. How long do you think it will be before we have an estimate on how long it will be?" You know, they'll try to like find some roundabout way to just figure out what they're going to do with schedules. Just leave them alone. You'll be the first to know when they know. So, all right, here we go. So let's talk about some examples of common failure modes, missed switches, that sort of thing. I'll start this out since I'm looking at a circuit breaker panel. So this goes back to my days, and thank you for giving me an aircraft transition credit in the intro there. So I did fly Cobras, not Apaches, although I did have an opportunity, but my head was too big during the early rollout of the Apaches. The helmets were too small in the first batch of helmets. So I just flew Cobras. But looking at this circuit breaker panel reminds me of one time when I was attempting to start a Cobra doing a standard start procedure. And one of the items that was typically pulled on a circuit breaker was like I don't know the exact name of the switch, but some people listening in might know is like a starter solenoid switch or something like that, igniter. And you would pretty much know as you started the sequence if you didn't hear the igniter ticking off when you started. You could see pilots would use their elbow and they'd reach back to the circuit breaker panel and pop that circuit breaker in while without disrupting the start so they wouldn't lose credit on one of their start cycles. So I had to do that one time. So it made me more aware of taking care of even the smallest minute detail of a circuit breaker. And some of these older circuit breakers might be a little difficult to even tell if they're popped. So that's my example of a simple little, a very important switch that you can't forget. Anything come to mind for you, Chris?
Well, once when I was in the Army stationed in Hawaii, we had a pilot that was doing something similar after a freshwater compressor rinse and had tried to start the engine and forgot and missed that the circuit breaker was pulled for the igniters. So during the start sequence and after fuel had been introduced to the engine and it didn't light off, he saw the circuit breaker, aha, and pushed it in. And when he did, as the mechanics explained to me, huge fireballs came out of the exhaust stacks.
Yeah, there's a certain window of opportunity where you get too much fuel in the can there, and it will cause a bigger problem. You just got to stop and start all over again. Yeah. So this brings me to another point here on the pre-flight, and that is the environmental conditions. So we're going to talk about a case study. Oh, sorry about that. I got to hit this a different way. There we go. Case study. Dynamic roller from a rollover from a hold down strap frozen skid. So the environmental conditions play a big role in how, and I think everybody listening here who's pre-flighted an aircraft can probably freely admit that if it was super hot, super cold, super windy, tons of mosquitoes floating around. That's one of my examples where pre-flighting an aircraft in intercoastal city before I go offshore, and there was a cloud of mosquitoes around that aircraft. Yet I have to go and pre-flight that thing like a professional. So it was one of those suck it up, just get it done, do it right, and don't regret, missing a step because those mosquitoes were chasing you around. But you wanted to talk a little bit, I think, about this frozen skid dynamic rollover situation there.
I had experienced it in Korea. And it was one of these before sunup launches when I was stationed on the DMZ flying scouts, and the skid tubes routinely would freeze overnight into the rice paddy. And our technique was to increase collective pitch and then use the cyclic to kind of rock the helicopter, in addition to trying to free it with an entrenching tool in the dark, banging into the frozen mud. In this one particular morning, one skid tube broke free and the other one didn't, and the aircraft started to roll over. And the only remedy for that was to decrease the collective, not try to stop it with cyclic. And fortunately for me and my commanding officer that was sitting next to me, that worked rather well. So
Yeah.
when it happens all at once, and you have a chance to either get it right or not. But my point is that when you encounter something like dynamic rollover, it won't be because you read it on a checklist ahead of time. But the best thing to do is avoid it by reading the checklist ahead of time about those situations and making sure that the aircraft isn't somehow either through nature or through a mechanical means secured to the deck. Laura, are we frozen?
I was just going to ask if you're frozen. You are not frozen. I'm not frozen. Chris Hill may be frozen.
Okay, well, let me jump in and I will present.
And then if you need, I've got your presentation pulled up and ready to go as well.
No, that's okay. I just have to hit the share screen.
Yeah.
Share screen.
I can sing Jeopardy music.
Well, that won't help me. That's like staring at a mechanic trying to fix your aircraft.
That's the one thing that's guaranteed to make your repair take forever is if you stand there and stare.
All right. Am I sharing?
It's starting to share. It says you've started screen sharing, so it should pop up. There it goes. Yeah, you're in working mode.
Okay. Before I click presenter mode, it'll move it to a different screen. So let me get us back onto the right slide.
Yeah, you were on the one before that.
Circuit
Yeah,
breaker.
that one.
Okay.
There you go. Perfect. All right, I'm going back into lurk mode.
So on the last bullet here, what causes this to happen? I really would feel bad for someone that just said, I intentionally decided I'm not going to use a checklist, or I'm going to ignore the checklist. I'm going to rush my pre-flight because I'm in a hurry. I've got a passenger, they're late. Let's just go. Or as somebody once told me, it flew in, so it's going to fly out, so it'll be okay. And that those are really unfortunate situations that you can put yourself in. So I think one of the biggest problems that people encounter, including myself, are distractions or self-induced pressure. I'm in a hurry. I need to get this thing moving. So what are some of the cues that we have to building an effective checklist? And there's different tools you can use. There are EFBs. I have one where I built my own electronic checklist. And what I like about the electronic or ECL checklist is that even though it's not necessarily integrated into the aircraft, What's really bad about a checklist is when you have one and a lot of the material on it is NA, doesn't apply, and you find yourself constantly skipping. Or you have demarcation lines where you perform a bunch of tasks and then there's a break before you perform the next set of tasks. And then you take off and, oh, shoot, I didn't actually complete the checklist. So those are just traps with checklists. Doesn't matter what kind of checklist you use. What matters is that it's effective and it's an effective tool. So going back to ECLs or electronic checklists, you can write a checklist where you can take the manufacturer's checklist and put that in electronic format. And then in there, you can put notes and you can put steps that or remove steps that don't apply to your aircraft. And now you've got a checklist that you can keep up to date. What I like about it is you can share it with other pilots. You can send it as a file and you can put a date on it. So you know that, oh, I've got an updated checklist for this. And let's say you bought a new piece of avionics and installed it in your aircraft, and there's steps that you would undergo when you utilize that piece of avionics. Well, now you can incorporate that into your checklist. Then you have integrated checklists like I fly a 787, so it has an ECL that's built in and it's connected to the aircraft. So when you have a non-normal, you have an emergency, or just normal checklist steps, it senses the switch positions and it also turns things on and off for you. And it'll tell you, I turned this on or I turned this off. So no matter how you use it, just make sure it's effective for you. And as Laura would say, if you have any questions or you're not sure of something, go get with your CFI, get with your mechanic, do some research if you've got a new piece of gear in your aircraft and you want to include that in your checklist. So here's a little pop-up question. Which tool or aid do you think helps avoid missed switches? And we talked about the one in the Airbus helicopter where people were missing to power the tail rotor servo.
And Chris, I'm back with you. I don't know if you can hear me. You good?
That's good because you don't want me to botch up this slide.
Yeah, there's a reason they call it Old Town, and here for the internet. So apologies for that little glitch, but I'm back with you. So yeah, moving into first, Laura, did you have a question that popped in?
Yeah, I do. Dagmar chimed in on dynamic rollover. He said, just to share in training, I did a running landing onto a taxiway in an R-22. Upon stopping my instructor and I critiqued it. Unbeknownst to me, one skid shoe ended up on the seam of an asphalt repair, and because of the heat, it melted and the skid was stuck. Took a couple of attempts to break it loose.
Yeah, that's a good story. Yeah, so the smaller the skid, the more vulnerable they are to any small imperfections on the surface of the ground. So a lot more awareness necessary there. So Chris, I mentioned this earlier, but just wanted to make sure that everybody out there, if you want to get the right resource, obviously first and foremost, go to your manufacturer. This list is not comprehensive, but it captures the majority of the helicopter providers, and they've got all kinds of resources. If you go to YouTube or Google, you can type pre-flight. I would just caution you, like Chris mentioned earlier, there's some folks out there that might not have the authoritative information, might be some dated information, or it could just be downright dangerous, the things that they're suggesting. But most of the time on the subject of pre-flight, I think it's pretty universally accepted, the right procedures, the things that you need to do. It's pretty common sense. Mostly it's just good ideas that people out there, they're discovering things that they didn't realize could be a problem and sharing that with others. So I think you're in a good place if you start with that. But yeah, please enrich your knowledge, do some searching and find out what other people are doing and how they're getting through these in a creative way. So Laura, this was a question you had previously. So if you're looking for posters, things to hang up on the hangar wall or, that sort of thing. You can go to VAI has several resources on in our safety library. In particular, with this one program called the Spotlight on Safety, where each release, it can be quarterly, monthly. We're at about a quarterly release right now. You can see it, the top three there are all focused on pre-flight, post-maintenance pre-flight, slowing down, not being in a hurry, not letting yourself be rushed. And all of those posters, it comes with an article, most of them, and a video to reinforce the message. You can see that QR code on the left will take care of that. And then on the bottom, there's some cool old retro posters from back in the day with the HAI and USAIG. I like those, some of those classic ones. Some of you who prefer some of the more retro type stuff, there's a whole library of those from the safety series and that partnership. And then finally, VAI webinars on the bottom right. That QR code will take you to, oh gosh, several dozen webinars, probably over 80 or so, since they started doing them at the beginning of the pandemic, and they've been doing them on a recurring basis. I think we're going to be moving to a quarterly for those as well. So the top right image right there is a screenshot of that webinar, The Walk That Can Save Your Life. So I've stalled enough time so you guys can scan those codes, but if you have any follow-up questions, just go to verticalavi.org and you can navigate your way to the safety resources there.
And as we said in the beginning of the webinar, even if you're not a helicopter pilot, the message is still the same. And you may find, if you're a fixed wing student, you're a fixed wing CFI, that there's some good data points in this material that you can use. If you're flying a 182, if you're flying a Cherokee 6, if you're flying a TBM, it doesn't matter. A good pre-flight is a good pre-flight, and we all fall victim to the same traps.
Yeah. And we'll just go, you can hit the advanced slide a couple more times there, Laura. Thanks. So a couple more resources. So the FAST safety team, they've got a spin-off area for rotorcraft specifically, the Rotorcraft Collective it's called. They've got quite a few videos that they've been putting through. Chris is a guest in several of those, and you'll find some good information. The start of the series focused on a lot of helicopter pre-flight information there. So, and that top right one, pre-flight run-up and taxi, that's some good information that's provided as it relates to the cold weather. And then the VAST is a vertical aviation safety team. Chris briefly mentioned at the beginning. So this is I'd like to call it, for lack of a better term, is a good repository of predominantly helicopter vertical flight information. Think of it like Skybrary for rotorcraft. Even though Skybrary has several resources for rotorcraft, this was pretty much more comprehensive and focused on that type of information. And they've got a pretty powerful search tool within that. You can just type in the word pre-flight in the search box there, and it'll give you a host of pre-flight resources there as well. All right, Chris, you want to kick us off on this next section?
This is again a good treasure trove of real world examples, and they were provided by Wes. Wes is on the steering committee of the U.S. helicopter safety team, and he is a professor at UND, University of North Dakota. They have a great training program. In fact, when I flew for U.S. Customs, we had a contract with them for some of the helicopter training that we did. And I can't say I've experienced North Dakota flying there in the wintertime. As a student, I was blessed and being able to do it in the summertime. It was great. But UND is a premier institution for helicopter and fixed wing training, and they were generous enough to share some of their pre-flight examples that Chris took some time to enhance. So what are we looking at here, Chris? Is a Hughes or a Schweitzer 300?
Well, it's from there. Probably, I'm guessing it's an R22, but I'm not a positive. I'm not familiar with exactly what it is. As somebody watching, I'm thinking most of these are from their inventory, and I think that's predominantly what they fly, or their Robinson aircraft. But one thing to point out here is, if you don't recognize it, the cross tube that's going from one side to the other is slightly bent, so you can see that there are some tolerances. There can have a little bit of a bending in that, but that's one of those perfect examples of, if you see something like this, it might be worthy of checking with maintenance personnel to find out, hey, is this within tolerance? Yeah, it's a Hughes 300. So you're right there, Chris. So good catch. So they probably use some other library footage. It's not just from their own. So thank you for that.
Yeah, when I started life as a fixed wing pilot, and went in the Army, they had these Hughes 300s, and I remember looking at this for the first time, thinking, "Wow, I'm going to fly that." It's got a lot of moving a lot of moving parts and pieces.
Yeah, and so here, moving on to the next one, it's kind of, it doesn't take too much observation to see that there's a little problem there on the trailing edge of that blade, and it's, chip tail rotor blade. These types of things will happen during ground movements, that sort of thing, turning the rotor blades when you don't have, ground handling equipment clear of the aircraft. And another perfect example is this within tolerance. So get it checked out, get it documented, label it, and then keep track of it as you continue flying, or replace it if you're at that point, and don't push the envelope there.
How many, show of hands, how many people post flight their aircraft? And when you post flight your helicopter, do you look at the blades? And when you post flight your airplane, do you look at the prop to see if you picked anything up? Not just on pre-flight, but on post flight. That's a great time to find it. I speak from experience.
Yeah, in particular if you're landing in unimproved areas where lots of things get dusted up, or an ugly runway, or unimproved landing area. That's pretty good chance that you're gonna put yourself at greater risk. I mean, my wife flew C-130s into several of the Pacific islands, and there was this one island in particular, I can't remember which one it was, that had lots of Goonie birds. And so they every time they landed, they pretty much, or took off, they had about a 50-50 chance of hitting a bird and causing even bigger problems. So sometimes it wasn't obvious when that happened because there were just so many of them. So that was a pretty focused pre-flight, post-flight activity to make sure that they didn't encounter any damage from that. This one's a little less obvious. This is a landing gear assembly, evidence of hard landing, damaged landing gear fairing. If you can pick that little spot out, there's a little bit of the paint has rubbed chafe loose, so that's early telltale sign of some sort of a hard landing.
This is a good one.
Yeah. So I think this is from one of the UND's Robinson aircraft, but I could be wrong. It might be another type aircraft. But what's interesting, I think, in this one here is you can see the color of the tube remains the same with the indentation from the friction caused by there's a breather tube and eventually cut through from causing a pressurized oil leak. So somewhere down in that little crevice there's a hole that goes all the way through and lets that pressurized oil leak out of there. So common with tight spaces and compartments where there's a lot of mixed wire bundles mixed with other types of tubes and cables of that sort.
And this is a good pre-flight item after the aircraft's been in maintenance. If you're familiar, they make what they call chafing or anti-chafing tape and plastic, like a Romex that goes around this. So sometimes you cannot not have things that rub up against each other. So you have something that's sacrificial that will take the brunt of the friction. But sometimes in maintenance, they'll remove it. They'll put the line back on, and somebody may get distracted and forget to put the chafe tape back on it. And it won't take very many flights until you wind up with this situation.
Yeah, so for the Robinson folks in the room, they probably see something here that doesn't look right. For those of you who don't fly that type aircraft, you might be puzzled, but you can go ahead and advance it there, Laura, and we'll take a look and see. So the safety wire that's on that retaining nut is supposed to be aligned with that paint, and it's not. So that's a pretty quick telltale sign that there was I believe a starter overspeed is my understanding, not being qualified in that aircraft. Startup generating enough torque to slip the nut, and this was found on a post flight. That's the impeller. Another one that may not be immediately obvious to folks who don't fly this type aircraft, but if you look at the center there and advance the frame there, Laura, you can see that there's a little bit of an asymmetrical spacing around the flapping bearing there, and that is not a standard way to install that. So over time, that can be a problem. So needs to be addressed.
That's a tricky one. It really is. Sometimes too, if you're new to an aircraft, you can take pictures and store them where you can compare them to what it looks like in your present state and what it should look like from something that's static.
Yeah, that's funny you mentioned this. So this is tail rotor alignment, can slip over time, and it requires a flapping bearing to be retorqued and balanced. So it's a pretty big deal. You don't want to be running free and loose with any of your fast spinning parts here. You mentioned that, comparing notes, taking me way back, a lot of times we had uncertainty about the tolerances with certain pitch change rods and things like that. So what we would joke, we would say, let's check the Air Force manual. And that was code for go to the aircraft next to you and on the other side and see what those same tolerances are, just to kind of get an idea. Is this a systemic problem, or is this the only one that has that? Obviously, it's not very scientific, but when you're out on the flight line and you're just looking for some quick answer, that is something that we used and probably improved over time, just improving our knowledge. I think one of the questions that popped in probably is worthy of discussing there, Chris. So somebody was asking about, what if you're just doing a quick turnaround, you land, and you're dropping somebody off for lunch, and an hour later you're heading back out. How do you handle your pre-flight? How much detail you put into it? There's a term through flight, first flight of the day. That every company might have different policy and procedures. First and foremost, I'd say follow those. Obviously, when you fly your 787 and you do a quick turn, you may not go out there and do a full pre-flight itself, but when you have some smaller aircraft and it's easier to check all these parts and pieces, particularly some of the ones that are, flight control critical parts and pieces, it certainly merits a quick walk around and make sure all the parts and pieces are still there in one place. Anything to add there, Chris?
Yeah, well, going back to the 7.8, I mean, anytime it leaves the ground, you're going to look at it the same way every time. There's nothing that's abbreviated. In that community, because we fly over water or ETOPS, the aircraft has to get signed off by maintenance. So there's a pre-flight that maintenance does, and then there's one that the pilots do in terms of what's called a walk-around. And going back to your aircraft, or my aircraft, like I have an R66, and if I land somewhere, I'm going to do a post-flight. And I would encourage you, no matter what kind of aircraft you fly, please do a post-flight. You'll find things there, and it's better to find them on the post-flight than miss them on the pre-flight, or discover them on the pre-flight where maintenance could have been performed while the aircraft was on the ground. But I would perform the same due diligence every time when you're pre-flighting the aircraft. Once it leaves the ground, it's not going to get better. So take the time, especially in a helicopter. You've got so many rotating part assemblies. You want to, I have this image up of the tail rotor. You see these pitch change links. You could look at the upper one. There's a little bit of corrosion that's visible on it. You've got these slippage marks where you see if that fastener has moved at all. Why would you not want to inspect that every time before you leave the ground?
Yeah, right. Good feedback. All right. I think we're coming close to the end here. A couple more. Yeah, so the one on the left, we've got, the skid. I mean, that's a pretty common evidence of a stinger getting scuffed on either a low, no hover landing, or a running landing, or that sort of thing, single engine landing, or even an auto rotation where somebody pulled the nose up a little too high. That's what it's for, right? Protect that tail rotor in the background, and much better to scuff a stinger than that. But some of those can break pretty nasty. So I don't know if we had to buy beers for our maintenance personnel anytime we scuffed the back. That was just kind of one of our deals that we had to do, even though it wasn't much damage. Somebody had to go out there and repaint it. And of course, the boot torn, that can cause Obviously, some issues on debris getting in there. There's a reason the boot is there. So, a couple of easy ones to find if you're paying attention on your pre and post flight. So, I think that takes us to the end there. I'm not sure if there's any other, so one more kind of if you need to learn more about the USHST. Here we go. Yeah, one more here. Just kind of putting a bug in everybody's ear. What are your most important pre-flight items? I would say for me is treating it like there's always going to be something that you can find, no matter how hard somebody has worked on that aircraft to prepare it. There's, if you go in there, like treat it like a challenge to find something, you will, good chance that you'll find something that if it's not bad, it could be on the way to something that needs to be more closely monitored. And obviously some of the more critical flight control, fuel, things that can kill you, obviously the ones that you want to look at the most. Laura, you've popped on for a question.
No, I was just coming on for a Q&A
Okay.
after you guys have finished.
Okay. We are at the top of the hour. Chris, anything that you view as your most important thing that you always want to check for?
Yes, the thing that I missed.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. We just wanted to put that in your head before we leave you today to make sure, think in your mind, what is most important to you? What have you neglected in the past, and can you put that back into your planning, and make sure you allow that extra time? So I think we got maybe one more slide. Yeah. So Chris, I'll give this to you as the industry co-chair, and leave everybody with a closing thought on the USHST.
If you're not a member, you can become one by going to ushst.org. You don't have to be a helicopter pilot to have the benefits of being a member of the USHST. You can also have a free access to the Hughes app. And in the Hughes app is a bunch of USHST tools. One of them we just added recently, the VFR prediction tool, where you can put two places in and it will go and fetch weather. And there's an algorithm that will look at what the probability of VFR is along your route of flight, whether you're flying an airplane or a helicopter. So you could check that out, and you can get a USHST membership card. So USHST .org, there's a treasure trove of information there that we want to share with you. Our mission is to stop fatal accidents, and we can only do that with your help and your participation.
All right, we've got a few questions here. David says he suggests always using a flashlight during pre-flight because you can see in dark corners and it helps you focus attention, which there's a certain thing my mechanic has asked me to check on my plane that involves using a flashlight. So yes, have a flashlight when you're doing your pre-flight. Um, Ray says once had a Viking coming out of annual and was really difficult to start on post-flight